but let's get started. So thank you all for being here, for joining us for the what we call the Qualitative Analysis Bootcamp. We're going to be your drill sergeants, I guess, in one way or another. I hope, some of us maybe more than others. But we'll try and make it enjoyable, and also, of course, give you lots of advice going forward about coding and what you can do and what you can absolutely not do. So we'll definitely go there as well. But I maybe start with letting each one of us, well, actually, maybe Jane will give us a little bit of an intro in terms of just the history of the session itself, and then all of us will introduce ourselves so that you get a bit of an overview of who we are and what we do. And then we'll do a bit more process after that. But Jane, maybe you'll tell us a little bit about this session in particular.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Tina. So I'm just still seeing a few host 500s. So if that's you, rename yourself. So with that being said, I actually have to give the credit to Anne Smith, who together with Paulo Kane and Charlie Clotilde and a few others started this session many years ago. We were just talking about it. The first boot camp was actually held in 2013. But even before then, there was lots of kind of qualitative interpretive sessions and just helping people develop a qualitative toolkit, because as some of us went through the ranks, there was not so much teaching of methods, there was more learning by doing. And so we're helping the next generation of scholars, we hope, to kind of build up the work. And every year we've got a new theme. So a few years ago, it was using qualitative analysis software. We looked at using different kinds of techniques, for instance, working with video data. We looked at connecting and theorizing from data, different types of analysis. And as you see, this year, we're coming to you with yet another set of experts and yet another set of ideas. And so Tina will go a little bit through the format and give us a chance to introduce ourselves, but that's just to understand the history. So it's a recurring workshop. So if you come back next year, the year after, the year after, look for us. We're probably back again doing a little bit more boot camping.
Thanks, Jane. So I think we'll do a just once around for the four of us to give you just a bit of background about who we are. You will have seen in the description of this session on the AOM website that there was a bit of prep work to do. So essentially, we've uploaded instructional videos for how to do 4 different styles of coding, the 4 different styles that we represent. And so those videos kind of, you would have watched ahead of time. And then there was a text excerpt that we uploaded on which you could have tried one of those coding approaches or all of them if you were very diligent. And then basically we'll have breakout groups where we debrief some of that coding and discuss some of the coding in a little while. But maybe let's just do a quick round. My name is Tina Köhler. I'm at the University of Melbourne. I get to hold a lot of workshops, especially on grounded theory and grounded theory coding in particular. But I also do in my research work with ethnography, case analysis, so also then case analysis coding and things like that. So, but I also do thematic code, whatever comes my way in terms of what seems to be suitable for the data and for the phenomena that I'm studying. So kind of, widening the toolbox is never a bad idea. So that's me. I'm going to hand it over to Gail to just introduce yourself briefly. And you got to unmute yourself, Gail, please.
I had made a mental note to myself to do that, and of course I didn't do it. Hi, I'm Gail Fairhurst, and I am on the faculty at the University of Cincinnati. I have been studying discourse for most of my career, although, believe it or not, I started out as trained as a survey researcher. But I've done a number of different types of discourse analyses, including quantitative coding schemes and certainly more qualitative coding schemes. What I'm going to talk about today is combining grounded theory with grounded theory methods, I should say, with discourse analysis. And in particular, looking at how we can draw upon the best of both approaches to get a really useful look at the subject of paradox. and tension and contradiction and dialectics in organizations. My approach will certainly apply to other topics that you might want to pursue, but Linda Putnam and I developed this approach specifically for paradox research. Tina, do you want me to talk about what I'm going to do in the breakout, or is that something you want to hold off until later on?
We'll do that in a second. Maybe we'll do a second round. So hold off for now, and we'll just do intros, and then we'll do breakouts. And go ahead. And do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, didn't hear you. Yeah, Ann Smith. I'm at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I'm the department head here, and I've really come to this probably a different way. Maybe Gail mentioned that she had come to this discourse through surveys. I really was trained in a very quantitative fashion, but my dissertation took me into more interpretive methods. I consider myself a pragmatic. I like to demystify the whole arena of the messy process of coding. So I take a very pragmatic approach. I'm very much akin to a recent paper that's coming out with this issue that Tina and I are editing, a paper about coding with Locke, Feldman, and Golden Biddle. Really like that paper a lot, and this whole focus on iterating. So so that's really what my approach. I self-identify now as a methodologist, although my background is in strategic management, and look forward to getting to know some of you.
Jane?
Great. So I'm Jane Lee. I'm a professor of strategic management at the WHU Otto Weisheim School of Management, and I'm a die-hard interpretivist. So like most people here, I started off as a hardcore psychologist. So IO psychs, straight up stats and surveys, and during my PhD, fell into qualitative methods, and after much grieving, fell in love with qualitative methods. And so now you'll see me bouncing around, all research methods type stuff, CAMA, ORM, so I really, really love methods. So I'm looking forward to having some interesting conversations with you.
Great, thank you. All right, so kind of going forward, and working under the assumption that pretty much most of you will have had the chance to watch one of the videos or all of the videos and do some coding. We'll pretty much directly go into breakout groups and discuss the different coding strategies that you've used and kind of, difficulties, potentially challenges that you saw, just kind of your experiences, getting a feel for how you felt the coding went, and then maybe providing some advice along the way about how to do this. You will self-assign yourself to breakout groups. So that's why we will go through briefly and tell you what we're going to do in our respective breakout groups in a second. But so you will see when we open up the breakout groups, 4 different sessions, one for each of us, and you should pick the one that you're kind of most interested in, or for which you've done the coding. And then basically we'll come back after the breakout group. So we have a good amount of time in the breakout groups. We'll come back afterwards and do a bit of a panel discussion amongst us, where we can answer some of your questions, can also talk about some of the bigger challenges with particular coding approaches or cross-coding approaches that we see, and then just talk about some of the more general, I guess, issues, but also opportunities in coding. But yeah, we want you to get your hands dirty first. And so to some degree, it always helps when you have done a bit of coding to then basically ask some questions about it in regards to more general approaches. All right, so maybe we'll do once around in terms of what we're planning to do in our sessions. I may start with Gail and then kind of come back around.
Okay, yes. So with my particular qualitative approach, we're calling it an integrative methodology between both discourse analysis and grounded theory methods. I'm going to start out by talking about, just very briefly, why study organizational discourse and why then combine it with the grounded theory approaches. Why do we want to apply this to paradox research? And so I'll just really briefly orient you in that direction. I'll then follow up with how to identify major discourses in the data, That will be followed by how these competing discourses generate tensions and contradictions. And then finally, how they are being responded to. What I'll be doing then is seeing a little bit how you've answered several of these questions, and hope to get some good conversation going back and forth.
Great, thanks, Gail. Anne, do you want to talk briefly about your session?
Yes, I think mine is labeled pragmatic coding when you have the breakout rooms. So I'm really looking at what I discussed in the video, which is your initial reaction after you've read the interview. What were some initial reactions? Then we're going to get into what would you code in a very broad stroke? What would you code more narrowly? Then we're going to stand back and do sort of a thematic analysis. Well, what's going on here? And talk about what's the story. So that's the process that I'm going to take you through. And again, I did want to make one caveat. Coding is really important, but it's one of many different types of activities you undertake during the data analysis. And I also am going to show you in my session using a Cactus program, a computer-aided qualitative data analysis software. I'm going to kind of show you what I did after we've had a lot of discussion, some ways to use the software. I think that's what I'm most comfortable with if you asked me in terms of coding. So that's what we'll do in our group.
Great, thanks. Moving on to Jane.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so I'm really going to do some interpretive work with you. So like Anne, I'm eclectic and I'm a pragmatist. So you'll see we're doing lots of different kinds of methods. Today, for the purpose of this session, I've asked you to do some thematic or keyword or topic-based coding. So what I basically want you to focus on is what's in the text. So I really want you to look at not what you want to see in the text, but what's actually in the text. And so I want you to start to develop some labels and the structure of what's in the text. But like Anne was saying, that's step one. So I have a second step that I'd like you to work through in my group, which is about developing a storyline. So tell me, what is this a story of? And basically start working through core constructs, start to kind of describe and explain some of the dynamics. And so this is really about developing storyline or vignette. So those are the two things that you'd be doing in my room today.
Thanks, Jane. And then finally, I'll do grounded theory coding with you. Well, I'll give you an introduction into the first kind of part of grounded theory coding, because grounded theory coding usually takes quite a long time to do fully and takes multiple steps. I mean, we already mentioned iteration before, but there are so many so many times that you have to iterate and then move up. So we'll probably do the introduction in terms of what grounded theory coding is about. And then basically really dig into the more granular details of the data. So that's the 4 breakout groups that are on offer. All right, so thanks a lot. I hope you all had great breakout group discussions and really kind of got into the nitty-gritty of things a little bit more, and then figuring out how some of these coding approaches work and what they give you and what they don't give you. I hope our drill sergeants weren't drilling you too much, but that's their job. All right, so what we want to do now is basically move into a bit of a panel discussion where we can talk a bit about some of the struggles maybe that we've heard from you, or challenges or insights, like maybe there were interesting discoveries that you've made in your respective coding. And then we also, of course, have a chance here for you to ask questions. So I'm going to keep monitoring the chat to make sure that we maybe can take a couple of questions that you have across the different coding approaches, or something that you wanted to ask more generally about coding, about publishing, qualitative work, etc. So, but I may get us started off. So maybe I asked each of our panelists to basically just say, was there anything like 1 or 2 points that you thought you wanted to highlight from your respective breakout groups? Something that you see often or is a common issue that is worth addressing. And I may get started with Jane and then move around a different way than before.
Thanks so much, Tina. So I think one of the things that was really nice in our room is that because we use this kind of more kind of pragmatic way of coding, thinking about, either going macro to micro and micro to macro, we ended up with very different answers and very different kind of perspectives in the room. So no surprises here to any of us who code data, right? But it's a nice reminder for us that we, our particular perspective will guide the analysis, and that the focus is really, really important. So the earlier you can focus, the more targeted your work will be. And that means in terms of writing a specific paper and targeting a particular contribution, that will help you. So that would be one takeaway. The other very important point is that when you code, that code has to be evidenced in your data. So you can't just say, this is about love. Show me the love in the data. And so it's really about showing us the evidence and understanding how you code evidence and how you work with evidence. And so that's one part of it. And the second part of it is having a label that actually captures and communicates that data appropriately and adequately. And then the last point I would make is just this notion of, working with other people, sparring, getting feedback on your work. Even as you're coding, whether that's from another person, another bit of data, or something to help you spar and think about the data in multiple different ways to make your coding and the way that you code, as well as the structure that emerges, really, really robust. So those are three of the things that we talked about, then I would bring back to the room.
Great, thanks, Jane. I may ask Anne next. So I see some of the questions in the chat, and I also see the raised hand. So we'll get back to your questions after we've done one round in terms of just observations from the breakout group. So Anne, go ahead and tell us what was common in your group.
That was a great group. They were a lot of fun, and we really did talk about broad brush stroking, which is not theoretical, and I think a lot of people thought that that was more theory. It's more to capture time differences or actual versus hypothetical examples in your data. And then we looked at coding at a very low level, and I think the main point that people probably took away is it's very iterative, that we are the instrument and we bring to the text ideas from our coding, but also from our knowledge of the literature and what interests us. But we really are an instrument to make sense of it. I agree about the sparring sessions. We talked about insider, outsider. And I showed them a little bit of what the coding might look like in a qualitative, a computer-aided qualitative data analysis software, and talked a little bit about that as well. But it's a good group. It's the reality of coding. I think I ended with Kaplan-Orlikowski's paper in Org Science showing the 5 rounds of coding and reality. And that's just, it's just so real. You're constantly iterating through your data. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Gail, what are you bringing back?
Yeah, we had a really lively discussion of some of the differences between discourse analysis and more grounded theory methods. One of them being that a discourse approach goes beyond the analysis of content, and that's an important kind of understanding to have. Also that the discourse analyst begins with a rather raw sort of gut level, something interesting is going on here, and you don't quite know what that is. And that's why I very much relate to this iterative notion, Anne, because it's a successive refinement of what you're looking at. And then we had a very interesting discussion about what do you call something, right? And is what I call a particular discourse what someone else would call a discourse, or would they name something somewhat different? And the argument that I made is what you can defend, right? In terms of what the actor is saying, how those, how the various features hang together in a particular way. Do they make sense? And so there's a lot of sort of back and forth and iteration that goes into what you call something, because what you start out isn't what you may not end up with. And that's a very important thing to identify. So yeah, wish we had a little more time. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Gail. actually, I think similar themes came up for us as well. So lots of talking about iterations, the going back and forth between, different coding rounds, coding for different things, like Anne said, in the data. So, the time, process, mechanisms, all sorts of things, running those comparisons, I think, between, input that you're getting from different people. So we talked a little bit about, for example, triangulation and how to use that in your data collection, but also, of course, in your data analysis. So I think lots of themes that may potentially cut across our different approaches and different experiences that may be common to the coding process itself. So I want to make sure that we give people enough time to ask their questions. So I know that Adil has been very patient having their hand up. So maybe we'll go to you first, and then I'll pick questions from the chat.
Thank you very much. I don't know, the voice is clear? Okay. Yes. Thank you very much for this workshop. Just I have two questions. If you're writing your research in English but the interviews are in different language, do you recommend translating the transcript or before the coding, or just the codes? Because it's not that we care too much in business about the terminology itself. The meaning is more important, and this is one opinion. When I search, I find that if it's like linguistics or something, you have to code in the original language. But what about business? And the second question is, if, like, some people are talking a lot in interviews, and I heard that in this session that sometimes we just, especially if we're not doing grounded theory, we just get rid of the things that we think it's not related. I usually put them in a separate file. In what round of coding that I can say that I'm not going to look at them completely? Is it from the second or the third? Thank you.
Thanks. So I saw Jane was having kind of facial reactions to the first question. So maybe I'll just give you the first question, and then I'll put the second question to somebody else.
Thank you. So as someone who is largely English speaking, working in a German context, please do not translate all of your interviews. I mean, it's just not a good investment of your time, because first of all, when you're coding, and especially if you're coding with the language and the expressions of the field, it's more natural to code in the language of the data. Now, later in life, when you publish, you will need to translate some of those quotes as exemplars in the papers. But when I work with my students that collect German data, the whole paper is in English except the quote. And at the very end, when we decide which quotes are actually going to be sent, that's when we do the translation. So we don't do a lot of back and forward translation, except to ensure that we check the robustness of the quotes until the very, very end. Why? Because it's a huge investment of your time, and no one's going to see your transcripts ever except you. So why are you doing it? So I really would ask you not to do that. If you were a positivist and you really were following a positivistic method, then there's expectations that you do translation, back translation, retranslation, but we're not doing that. So focus on what needs your attention and your cognitive capacity, which is the kind of coding and interpretive process. So please only select quotes when you're ready.
So I may just briefly add to that. So I do a lot of cross-cultural research. And for me, there are certain aspects of meaning that are actually encoded in how people say something. And that meaning often gets lost when you translate it. You often cannot translate certain types of meanings the way that somebody has said it in their native language. And those can sometimes be really interesting to analyze out for certain themes. And so I never do that, because I think something gets lost in the translation that you don't get back. But it, of course, also means that you have to have a research team that reflects those different languages, right? So that you can actually analyze at a native speaker level those different interviews that you got in different languages. But for me, that is an important component in terms of how people have said things. So again, it depends on the approach, the research questions, your epistemology. It depends on so many things. But I would not translate either. So not a good idea. I'm not sure if the other two wanted to follow up, or if we basically covered that, because we could go to the second question at this point. Okay, seems like we can move on. So the second question was about, when do you get rid of things that are not related? Or, when do you think that you're reducing data down to specific aspects or subsets of the data for your analysis? So I may field that to Anne first and then see if Gail has a follow-up to that.
I'm gonna let Gail go first on this, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Well, every project has its sort of own long and winding road, right? And so sometimes you end up eliminating things just along the way, just based on where one step of the data leads you. Sometimes it's in the review process where, reviewers seem more interested in one aspect over another. There's just a lot of different ways in which you make decisions about what you're not going to use. I know as a former editor and as a reviewer, I know that it's sometimes difficult to read papers that say, we chunk the data in this particular way, and that's in another study, and you're left with questions about what was chunked and what wasn't. And, that's sometimes frustrating because the article that you're looking at seems to be impoverished from a data perspective. So it's all different. And I would say each study has to have its own integrity in terms of what you think the contribution is, and you cut along those lines.
Yeah, I thought I wanted to hear your response, because I thought you were talking about the coding. What do you get rid of? Sometimes I'll have a code called fluff, and I'll just say, is this kind of fluffy part? It's probably not going to end up being in any sort of quotes and whatever. And that's how I'll disaggregate an interview. Can't think of a time when I've gotten rid of any data. I'm kind of in the Pratt camp of less telling, more showing. I'd rather overshow. I can't think of any project where I've just like gotten rid of an interview. And I don't know if that's the gist of what you were talking about, but I think you do, when you're coding, you identify those power quotes. You found those really powerful quotes. And I guess it relates back to our theme for this. Don't think you'll remember that. Tag it and put a comment on it. This is a great quote I want to use in the paper, or something like that. So don't think you'll remember. I'm a lot older than anybody else that's here, but don't remember anything now. I tag everything if I have an inkling that this may be something that's going to be helpful down the road. I can't think of when I've gotten. I don't think I've ever done that. So.
So I would just jump in and just follow up on that. I guess I misunderstood the question. We sort of have when Matthew Sheep and I work together, which we do frequently, we have a category called quotable quote, QQ. And so if we see something just like you spoke about, Anne, where we think it's important that QQ says that to us, but we can't exactly identify what that is, we come back to it then because we know it's important.
Right. So I'm just kind of popping stuff into the chat as well. Now we had a question earlier that was in the chat, so I just want to go back to that one first. And that was a question from Indu about how many quotes are sufficient for each code. So that's a very pragmatic question. So maybe, Anne, are you fine with me handling that over to you? As a pragmatic, how many quotes are enough for each code?
Well, enough. It's almost impossible to answer that question. In the paper I've written with Paul O'Kane and Mike Lerman and myself about using software, we do have a technique, and then we look at we look at code frequencies. And sometimes something that's just has one code to quote can be extremely powerful. So I don't have any rules of thumb. And those of you that were in my room know that I've pretty much said, let the project drive you. And so I'm sorry, I'm not I don't really have a good answer to that.
No, that's fine. So one of the things that, for me, it depends on the level of coding that you're doing, because there are some kind of pieces of advice that basically say, so if you're at the very kind of granular level of coding, and maybe that only applies to grounded theory, you usually so there's some suggestions to say, once you have 6 to 12 examples of when you applied that code in your data, have a look at those 6 to 12 examples and come up with an idea of what this particular code may be a larger theme of, or what it may indicate, right? Maybe those 6 to 12 things are not actually the same. Maybe you've coded it the same, but they're not actually the same thing. So it's more of, in the process of coding, you have to take stock at certain points in time to make sure that you're not just coding everything the same and just find a term that's too integrative or too summative, and that you leave space for the nuances. So you have to actually figure out, am I coding with codes that are useful, that actually capture meaning, or am I just summarizing the data? Summarizing the data is not very helpful usually. So your coding is not just there to put data in buckets that have very little meaning beyond the keyword. Your coding is there to make the meaning underlying the data accessible to you, right? So that's kind of a rule of thumb that's out there, but in the end, really, it doesn't matter at all in terms of how many quotes you have per code, because your codes will change. It's more figuring out how many quotes do I need to really understand what's going on. And another quote may actually change your understanding of what you're seeing. So that's kind of where that iterative nature comes in for me. What a reviewer will think are enough quotes per code can be a whole different story. But honestly, in my data analysis, I tend not to think directly about what does a reviewer want me to do, because it may not, that approach may not serve me well in analyzing my data. That approach may just try to make me do things that I think will be successful in getting a paper published, not actually ending up with a really good piece of work. So, not sure. Is that enough, or did anybody else wanted to add on to that from our panelists? All right, then we may go to Benjamin, who has his hand up.
Okay, thank you. I have two questions, one for Jane and one for Anne. So my first question, Jane, when Tina was giving her video file, she described her process as data collection and data analysis being concurrent, and she codes her first interview and that informs her second interview. So I was wondering, is that the same for your style of coding, or do you collect multiple interviews before you code? Then my second question for Anne. Anne, you described a paper in your video file about when you interviewed plant managers and you had them divide their day into 5 buckets. So I was wondering, those 5 buckets, were those categorized by you or by the respondents? And if, okay, you're shaking your head. So they're from the respondent then. So, okay, so my question was gonna be, is that deductive? But no, it's instead interpretivist. Okay, so Anne's question we got.
So I might jump in then. Thank you so much. I'm really someone who jumps into an organization with a bunch of buckets and runs around, gets all the data she can get. So I don't think you were in my room, at least I didn't see a video on, but I was just saying I have a PhD student right now who started in January. It's July. We've been in the organization for 6 months. We've attended 100 meetings and we've done about 60 interviews plus a bunch of documents. So we're halfway through the project. It's going to be a crazy data set. That's who I am. I love data everywhere. So do I code all of that data and transcribe it before I get my next bit of data? No, I have to be opportunistic. And the good news for me because I tend to look at real life, naturally occurring data, doesn't matter, because that data is going to occur the way it occurs, regardless of how much I've analyzed, that they're still going to do their meeting the way they do their meeting, whether I'm there or not. And for the interviews, it's true to say that sometimes some focus would be nice. And I do sometimes find myself having to go back and ask a few more questions because I didn't have enough focus at the start. But I would say that while I start to do some coding in early analysis, I'm not as maybe rigorous as Tina is in terms of kind of following the process backward and forward. But I'm really kind of in there like a firecracker, grabbing everything and sorting it out later. Good
Okay.
question.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
I will say the 5 bucket question was one of the best all-time questions I've asked in the field, because it led me to one of the key findings was how many hours these plant managers were spending on the plant floor. Having worked in manufacturing, I was astonished. So I just wanted to give that as background.
And just to follow up on that, Anne, if you had pre-assigned the categories to respondents, if you had said, divide your day up into these 5 categories that I'm assigning, but if you had done that, would that be considered a deductive form if it was coming from theory to inform
Sure.
the names?
Yeah,
Okay.
but these were all award-winning Baldrige plant managers, so there hadn't been a lot written about them. So I wanted to hear what they said.
Yes,
That's,
exactly.
that's
Sounds
good.
great. Thank you.
All right, so there were 2 more questions that came through in the chat. Let me just go to one of those first, but I saw Murad's hand up, so give me a second to just address one of those. So one of the questions was around, sometimes I feel like I'm too in the weeds when I'm coding. I'm creating lots and lots of smallish codes. Do you have any advice if you worry that you're being too granular? Maybe that's actually more of a grounded theory question to start with. Yeah, I mean, look, the thing about granularity is I want to have that. So I want to feel somewhat overwhelmed early on, because I want to have lots of stuff going on in my head about all of the different things that are piquing my interest. And at some point, of course, you gotta start finding, ways to reduce that down to themes that you think are most useful. And of course, that's what the coding is trying to help you do, right? So to sift through all of those granular codes. But I like that part of being in the weeds and feeling like I'm being pulled in lots of different directions, because in a way, that's really reflecting the complexity of what's going on in the data. So I try to refrain from settling on a direction too early. And that will also mean that I will do a lot of coding that will never end up anywhere. It will never go into a paper. It may actually, I go down lots of blind alleys and down lots of rabbit holes. But actually, every blind alley tells me something. Like, it tells me that's not it. And identifying that's not it and what's not it is just as important as finally ending up figuring out what it is. In fact, you often have to identify what it's not to get to what it is. So I like that kind of, I guess, that feeling of insecurity, of being in the weeds, of sifting through a lot of stuff. And I keep that going for a very long time. But I do understand that can be overwhelming. So in order to remedy that, you can look at sub-themes and then basically keep track of what other themes you want to look at after that. So you can approach the data in different ways, from different angles, with different granularity.
I could just jump in here. I would say just building in some exercises and zooming in and zooming out, right? In other words, taking the time to reflect on what it means to be in the weeds, and and just sort of step back and say, geez, what are my feelings at this particular stage in terms of what the data is meaning? And I think sometimes putting the coding down and stepping away and coming back the next day, I mean, there are all different ways in which you can let your brain work unconsciously to be sort of processing what you're doing. But I have always found trying to take conscious steps to move away from the data to talk about issues of broader significance allows me to go back in and fine tune in the way that Tina talked about.
Great, lovely. So let's go to Murat, and then there was another question in the chat.
So once you are in a particular context for a while and you're interviewing and coding, how do you make sure that you don't start filling in the spaces based on your own interpretation, which no respondent has said, but you sort of start making connections which might not exist? In other words, as a researcher, you want to make connections, but if you are embedded in a context for a significant time, let's say over a year, you might start making connections based on your own grounding in the context. So how do you distinguish between the two?
So I'm not sure if I have enough information to answer that question. So I'm trying to understand where it's going. But if any one of the others has a direct reaction to that, it may just be me being a bit thick. So can you just, so I'm getting head shakes. Gail, you seem to maybe have a handle on this.
So, I mean, I think to some degree that's normal, right? I mean, because you're recognizing a trend or a theme or a broader discourse going on in the data. And so there's that filling in. But I think that's where the sort of the disciplinary aspect of your methods come in. You know, when you're essentially formulating codes, you're having to, you know, make sure that that category has integrity, right? And that you've been able to fill that category. And I think that, and I saw Jane just put in the chat, which reminded me, you know, talking about these codes with other people and having them challenge you as well. I do think that it's partly normal, but it's also partly something you have to guard against in terms of, you know, what the data shows and what you're actually able to show with the data and the examples you're able to provide.
And you unmuted yourself earlier. I'm not sure if you wanted to add to that.
Well, just a small little geeky comment. Sometimes you see things moving through interviews, the way they talk about things, you may see patterns. And in that paper, we talk about cactus. Sometimes you can actually see how things move through it, several different interviews, and they talk about this and this, and you can be connected through how you've done your coding in the transcript. So I'll leave it at that.
All right, there's one more question here, or there were a couple more questions, but so one question was around, you know, us mentioning coding for different reasons, mechanisms, or processes, and how we do that in practice. So if we use different colors, if we integrate them into different aspects of the codes, like how do you essentially code for different, maybe different levels, different themes, different aspects of the phenomenon that's going on? Jane, you're nodding, so I'm going to hand that to you.
Yeah, it reminds me of the olden days when I first started coding and I was young and naive and I printed out all my transcripts and I highlighted everything with highlighter pen. And then I realized, round two, it's not easy to make orange highlighter pink or yellow. So that's when I learned about software. So I chucked all that away and started with Envivo. And back then it was Nudist still. And I would say that if you have a data set that, you know, goes beyond something reasonable, and reasonable for me is sort of 20, 30 interviews, after that, I would really advise having some sort of system to manage your software, your data, not because it makes you a better analyst or produces better outcomes, but just because it saves time, especially in the coding and recoding process. You know, when you dive into a bucket of data, it pulls up all bits of text coded to that. Whereas in the olden days, like Anne knows, we'd get the envelope out with all the bits of text cut out, labeled by respondent. Don't do that. It takes way longer. So that's what I would say. I would say, you know, use a system where you're really, really rigorous. Like, you know, one of the things I look for in my PhD students, people who are really pedantic. I want people who are really specific and pedantic, that are going to label every bit of data and make sure it's all in a spreadsheet. It's organized. You've got it in Vivo. You're starting to code it. There's a process and a rigor to it. And that's what I would also suggest to you. So structure, process, and write everything down that you've done so you remember and you can recount it. That would be my advice.
All right, perfect. So I think so officially this session is kind of scheduled until, sorry, I'm of course an Australian Eastern Standard Time. So I'm like 7 a.m., but I mean, whatever the end of the hour is for wherever you are. So, but we also had, so basically our time slot included your pre-work to the session as kind of the first hour of the session. So by no means do we have to feel like we need to stick around much longer past this, but we want to make sure that we address your questions. So some of you may have to head elsewhere. because there may be other sessions that are going on. I think Jane mentioned in the chat to me that the SAP folks may have to head over to another session. So by all means, feel free to do that. And then even some of us panelists may have to leave to go to other places. I'm happy to stick around a little while longer to see if there are any remaining questions that need to be addressed that are urgent. But I just kind of wanted to plug in at this point. Thank you all very much for coming. And thank you all for bringing your very interesting questions, for engaging with the different coding approaches, and thanking our panelists to make time and talk you through all of the different coding approaches that are out there. But yeah, feel free to stick around a little bit if you have questions that we can still answer. And for everybody else, have a good AOM. And thanks a lot for joining us today. Miguel, just unmute yourself.
Yep, sorry. I just have one suggestion. I made it to Anne in a private chat. I'll make it to you all. I was in a breakout where we didn't look at any of the coding we did. So it could have been recorded. I was wondering if in the future you would consider recording the breakouts as long as they don't show individual data. I would have loved to see to have seen the other breakouts. So it's just a suggestion because you guys did so awesome. Now the question, Tina, for you is, and maybe for the others is this. I did the exercise. I'm not sure what I've gotten. I've told you about my bottom up, top down issues. I don't know if I coded categories or if I coded codes or if I did something first order, second order. I think that the orders can be reorders, so I get confused. So I would like you to look at that if you could and see, because what I did was actually go with you and also a little bit of what Jane suggested. I did like a mix. I just wanted you to tell me if I should have done something else. So I was wondering, I don't mind people looking at mine, and I couldn't give a rat's ass. So,
I mean, that may actually be a really nice thing to do. So if you're sharing your screen, you know, it could be a good example of how each one of us across the different sessions would have coded this differently, right? So if you don't mind sharing your screen, we can definitely do that.
I can wait until the others ask their questions. I don't want to monopolize, or I can do it now. What do you prefer?
Well, there weren't too many other questions in the chat. There was, I think, one very general one around, you know, what the most important piece of advice is in order to make qualitative research publishable. I think that's kind of a question that will take us another half hour to discuss. So given that we're focusing on coding at the moment, maybe we'll take your question first. That's much more focused on the coding part of things. And then if we have some time, we can talk about publishable qualitative research.
All right.
So go ahead.
All right, I'll share mine and I'll explain what I did before you actually read what I did. So what I did is this. I basically had the text here, line by line. Then I had in vivo or in vivo, I have no idea how to say this. In vivo, that's how I call it, and in vivo codes. Then I had in vitro codes per line again. Then I did some labeling or categorizing of those, you know, trying to summarize some of these. And then I did some memoing, including things about the questions themselves. Because I didn't want to lose all the lines, I didn't wrap the lines, but I'll do it for you to see it. But did you understand what I did, first of all? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yeah, yes.
Okay. All right.
So yeah, I understand what you've done.
Okay, so I'm gonna wrap the text so I lose the line synchronicity, but basically the in vivo codes, I basically got quotes. I made sure that I recognized what interview that was about, because I'm assuming to have many, right? And what lines they were referring to. In the in vitro codes, I had ideas, whatever I thought that would represent what is this, what is it that they're saying. So sometimes I would say perceived expectation of mandate to grow, something like n-skill growth create problems that would not exist if questioned before, or I would say growing requires knowledge and skills not every entrepreneur has, or entrepreneurs who are unwisely growth driven and not growth competent fail because they bring in inadequate personnel. And then here is where I started to combine some of these and recurrent themes that I heard. The growth imperative is one, the failure by unskilled growth, or entrepreneurial shortcomings drive failure, entrepreneurial shortcomings, again, or external support may drive failure, that sort of thing. And here I started to think of some relations. Now, what I'm asking is, are these codes or am I over-interpreting?
So, I mean, I think we may have a round to go through like what everybody else thinks. So for me, for a grounded theory approach, so I would go, if you go back to your kind of the original text, if you just scroll to the left. So basically from the text, I would call it much more granular. So in a way, you know, my first couple of codes may be around, you know, growing a business, maybe, you know, for the first sentence. It may also be questioning. So I may have a code that just says questioning, or questioning the status quo, questioning core opinion. So I may code this in multiple different ways with multiple different labels. And so my in vivo quotes my in vivo codes are not quotes most of the time. So they are a shorthand form of what topics or what I think is being coded. So what I think the quote relates to. And then basically I do a whole second run again, where I then look at, so every time, for example, that I have coded questioning the status quo, questioning an assumption, I'd look at all of the quotes that I would have coded in that way to see something that's going on that's lying behind the questioning of assumptions. So, you know, how are they being questioned? Why are they being questioned? What is being questioned? So I ask then lots of questions, and from that I develop more codes. So, you know, there may be questioning of, again, questioning of assumptions. That may be different from questioning of roles or questioning of responsibilities or whatever else. So for me, this process happens super iteratively. So I may go through once and just code the first kind of things that come up, and then I may go through it again and code more things. And then from there, I develop categories. Not all of those categories relate to each other. Does that make sense? So basically, I would go more granular than what you have at the moment. I would also, so for what you have as in vitro quotes, for me as a first stage would already go too far in a grounded theory, because they make evaluative statements. Granted, that's what the person said, but I may end up there later after I've taken it apart, because I in grounded theory, for me personally, I want to move away just from everything the person said into kind of how they said it, when they said it, why they said it, and I want to do the connecting of constructs a little bit later.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, first you would have done more granular.
Yep.
Second, what I did in vivo, you would probably separate in a bucket for quotes, and your in vivo codes would be a little more contextualized. You would contextualize, or you would put stuff that there's a little bit of you there, right? I mean, not only necessarily what is in there in the text. And what I called in vitro, on the other hand, you would have gotten much, further along with some categorization. That's what you're saying. Did I understand?
I may or may not have. So it depends a little bit. So code. So I don't need to code, or I don't need to select quotes out, right? So I use software usually. So basically, if I go in there and I code growing a business, later on, when I pull the code for growing a business, all quotes that relate to that will come up. And so the in vivo code is growing a business. And then the quotes associated with that basically help me understand what the code actually is about. From that, I'll then extract meaning about theoretical relationships. So what you have as in vitro quotes may never actually end up being quotes for me, depends on what I'm paying attention to. So if I, for example, pay attention to questioning of assumptions, I may develop higher level quotes that really deal more with questioning behaviors or with mechanisms that elicit questioning. So my higher level codes usually relate to more of the mechanisms and the patterns that I see rather than what is being said in the interviews.
Correct. And what I see is that mine seemed more like summarizing.
And that's fine, because with grounded theory, I didn't tell you more in the videos in terms of the higher levels of coding, because you wouldn't get there. So as a first step, that's fine. Just basically making sure that you drill down enough. So that's how I would approach it. But I think it's a good idea to actually hear from everybody else, because this is a potentially really good way to distinguish how you code in different traditions. Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, I would say that my coding is probably a little bit more forgiving. So I do very much follow the process that Tina follows. So when I heard her speak, I was like, yep, I do that. Yep, I drill down. Yeah, I come back up. Yeah, I go back in. So definitely, I think the process is similar in terms of kind of the iteration, but I stay a little bit more at the macro level. So I might have a code that's called something like conflict. And then from there, I might code big chunks of text, and then later delve into that and kind of break it up. So I might go exactly the opposite way that Tina is doing it, but I still will delve into the detail. And I think one of the tricks is to make yourself really, force yourself to be accountable for your coding and make sure that you code everything that's in the data and not ignore what might be noise, because it might turn out not to be noise. And this is the kind of, keeping yourself honest and staying with the data. So in terms of process, actually, I would keep some of those big labels that you have as codes, and I might have those labels later in a process model or as some of the practices identify, part of the narrative that I put forward. But it will always involve more kind of delving deeply. And the other thing that I would point out is, because you're using a kind of format like Excel to code, of course, you have to kind of reiterate some of the quotations, right? If you're using a software program, those would already come in naturally. So you would always have the interplay between kind of the quote and the code right there with you. So it would make it a little bit easier for you to kind of see any codes that repeat and the data alongside it. So it probably was also because the tool that you're using is a little bit more static than probably the tools that most of us use. But I would say that I'm not too far away from where you are in kind of the labeling or the in vitro side of your coding.
And I'll just add one other point that I made in my group. I find a tendency to want a lot of times you want to code early at the theoretical level. So I always say code at a very low level, like the in vitro level. That looks very similar to what I was doing, because the software, it's a lot easier to merge than disaggregate. So I just make myself life a little bit easier, but maybe that's software driving my behavior. I don't know.
I appreciate you. You guys give me a lot of insights, but although some of these things, I guess I'm in the right track. One thing that I heard from all of you is that I did not do the in vivo coding that you would have done. You would have done conflict or growth or trust. Those are the things that you would have coded in vivo. Did I understand that part correctly? That's the only doubt that I still have.
So yes and no. So one thing that I always kind of point out is, so for example, trust, like, right, when you put this in, if your naming is too short, you're assigning labels that are based on a theoretical assumption of what trust is, right? So you're basically just labeling a trust, and that can often harm an understanding if it's really trust, because later on, you can only find it under trust and not on something under something else that it may actually be. So labeling a trust could be fine, but I then usually would also label it as something is like, what's the actual behavior that somebody's talking about? What is the actual thing that somebody's doing, feeling, thinking? So I usually have lots of different layers of coding that I go through. I may code for emotions. I may code for thoughts. I may code for certain behaviors. I may code for time, place. So, and I don't do this all at the same time. I may go through the interview transcript multiple times to capture other levels and other layers. And so in combination, then those things will start making more sense. So, I mean, growth in and of itself is pretty broad as a term. So growing a business is already a smaller term, right? Or stagnating growth is a smaller term. It may be much more specific about what the person is talking about in that sentence. You may later label it all under a bucket of growth, but that's what Anne's referring to. You got to start on the more granular, more disaggregated level to then later be able to tell if those different things that contain growth should actually all be aggregated under growth, or if they should be re-aggregated under other categories that tell you more about what's actually happening than just about what the person talked about. So very rarely theory sits in what the person talked about. It sits somewhere in between what they said and then of course what different people said. It's not just one person. You don't develop theory from one person usually. So that's why you start out with what is said, but you very quickly start in trying to figure out what the meaning of what is being said is.
Perfect, thank you. That I now understand better what Anne said. I'm sorry, Anne, I hadn't understood it before. And you're right, in the first elements, growth was actually there, but trust was how I interpreted the need for the owner to be there presentially to make sure that people didn't steal. I label it trust, but maybe that's not necessarily what it is. I completely got it. Tim, thank you very much, Jane and Anne as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. No, excellent question. I think this was actually a really good thing to do, to just also see that there are quite a few similarities across, I think, how we would code. It's maybe sometimes the access point is a different one, or, you know, the process may differ in terms of what we do in between. But we've done this a few times before in sessions where we all coded the same piece of text and basically ended up with lots of similar insights across, you know, some of the themes that have come up. So that's often encouraging as well. So it's not that you pick a particular method and then you're doomed. So you actually end up probably with a couple of similar themes. There may be other things though that you can do with a particular method that you cannot easily do with another, in terms of what you can pay attention to, or how it will allow you to visualize certain things that are happening in the data. But that's, you know, the content is still the same. You're still basing it off the same empirical data. Yeah. Did anybody else have any questions? I think I just lost track of the chat for a little while.
I might have just a naive question from my side. You all seem to be very obsessed with coding, which is not surprising because it's about coding. However, have you ever met a situation where you maybe came to the impression that this coding is actually not very helpful at all, because this categorizing, this I mean, I'm always wondering if this approach is not at the end bringing qualitative methods back to quantitative mindset. So this is what I'm under this impression quite often. And I happen to think that from my experience, which is, I do a lot of interviews in practice, in companies and in the context of strategic management. And I happen to stop coding at all, because I just felt that first of all, it's not that much important what people say. It's also important what is in the listening. So this is the first thing. So if you bring someone else, you will find someone else. This is my experience, at least. And the second thing, of course, it's important that you have all the repetitions and that you can recognize patterns. All of this matters, but to the same extent, it matters these little outstanding arguments that maybe just are dropped one time, but at the end, these little anomalies, so to speak, have much more power and insight for the actual question at stake. So to sum it up, I'm a little bit skeptic if this coding, it has its history, that's okay, but I'm not so sure, I'm not so convinced that it's actually helpful in any situation, particularly in strategic questions, which are always about how to interrogate, how to be in touch with the situation, not only how to describe it, but also how to come in touch with the situation. And I think coding is not always helpful. So sorry.
No, go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, I think actually you got your point across very clear. And there's a couple of things I would say. So first of all, Anne's comment that it's one of many tools, I think is a very important one. But I would say we can't disregard it, Heiko, because I do think that it forces us to look at the data in ways that we might otherwise not. And that's not to say you can't jump to abstraction. You know, sometimes I start my project with a little process model, thinking about some of the dynamics. You know, I'm a strategist, so I think, you know, in kind of big picture terms. And sometimes I pull out a process model, but I always do go back to coding. And for me, coding is just about, you know, whatever that level is, however micro macro that is. For me, coding is making sure there's evidence in our data set and making sure that the story that we tell is there. And so for me, it's just about kind of keeping myself to account and staying honest about the data. So it's not about frequency. It's not like, oh, 30% of interviews said this is definitely an issue, but it's about quality for me, that I can say, okay, this is the point that I'm making. Can I make that based on the evidence I have? So it doesn't mean that you have to do, you know, like Tina, hardcore grounded theory, you know, like, you know, that's a lot of work, Tina, and I really respect you, but I'm a little bit more, I guess, haphazard and pragmatic about it, but I really see the value in the method. And I think, you know, when it's about evidencing and rigor, then I do think some form of coding, whatever that might look like, is important for the part of the process. But that's not to say it's the only tool. And like Anne and like you, I sometimes start backwards too for fun, but I do normally do some coding too.
Gail, go ahead.
So I would just jump in and agree with all of that and say that, you know, it really does depend on what your question is, right? And how that's guiding you. I would say that one of the distinctions between more grounded theory methods, which tend to look at content, and discourse methods, which tends to look at what the discourse is doing, sometimes the discourse approach, if you're sensing that there's something going on there, and that is an interactional phenomena that has to be captured with some subtlety and depth, that there are discursive methods, rhetorical methods that allow you to unpack that perhaps a more straight grounded theory approach might not. So, I mean, I think that there's just, it just depends on what your question is, what you're sensing from the data. And that, you know, sometimes, you know, one is useful and the other is not, but just understanding that you have the ability to deploy a range of methods, I think is really how you want to situate yourself.
Yeah, I would have actually asked Heiko, so how do you analyze your data?
Interesting question. It is good that you asked me. So first of all, I'm trying to go into this situation free of any expectation, as far as I can be such naive, so to speak, and then I try to make some mind maps, so cognitive maps, so to speak. But then I try to actually forget about all this and try to acknowledge the individual person, and I take I'm particularly interested in the subtleties of wording, so to speak. So over the years, I came more and more into a kind of Lacanian analytical approach, which is not where I started from, which is more into which was more where you maybe are with your coding. And I have the feeling that in this in taking particularly taking this in bringing or giving people space to talk, to express themselves. This is actually what I'm looking at. But the other question is, sorry, maybe I'm a little bit confused now, but I'm actually not that much interested in analyzing data in this sense. I'm more interested in the question, how can people be engaged to interact, to see possibilities to speak that have not been there before this kind of interview. This is more what I'm interested in. I'm completely aware of the fact that this is something different than what you are talking about. So it was just a naive question. If you ever happen to think that this coding is not always helpful, but in a way that's pretty clear that it's always depending on the question that you have to tackle.
So Heiko, you might take a look at some of the work by John Schotter and Cunliffe, who look at what's called social poetics, but it's more of the aesthetics aspects of talk. And I think that helps get at some of the more philosophical questions that you're wanting to look at as well. And you might find that very helpful.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's quite far removed from grounded theory methods or more standard discourse methods, but it does take it into the dialogic realm, which is what I think you're thinking about. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Or even people who use as a method to engage with what they're seeing. Now, you got to really think about traditions at different points in time, right? So, I mean, so the only thing I would mention maybe for others here is most of the papers we see published in mainstream journals would have a hard time with this, I think. So there are outlets that are perfectly fine with this, and that's great. I mean, that there is a methodological plurality there that can be used, but I'm not sure when I would have seen a paper, let's say published in AMJ, ASQ, or whatever, that wouldn't have described a coding approach to analyzing their data. Whether or not that always was the most useful way to analyze is a different matter. But there's clearly an expectation that you have an analytic strategy that you've applied. That being said, there are lots of different ways to engage with your data that can be useful, right, at different points in time. And I think that's what Anne is also referring to when she says analytic moves. So, and you know, sometimes we call things analysis, sometimes we call it maybe engagement, right? So also thinking with your data and thinking about your data in different ways. For some of us, that may include drawing lots of graphs, pictures, making it visible somehow. I know that Nancy Adler actually talked at some point about using art to capture some of the things that she was saying in her data. So there are lots of different ways, again, to engage and to help you capture what's going on. So it's about how you're processing what you're seeing, right? But just as a caveat, I mean, I think for most of the journals that we engage with, that we want to publish our work in, a level of coding that is strategic is probably necessary to give a reader and a reviewer some sort of level of confidence that they can understand what you've done. And you know, that may be a limitation, but I mean, in the end, we need to communicate, of course, what we've done and how we've understood the data to somebody else that then hopefully can understand what we've done.
I would just add to that, I would say that's definitely the case for American management journals, maybe less so with respect to European management journals. Yeah.
Yes, that's a good point.
Yeah.
So it's good to look at different traditions and different journals, different readerships, all of those.
Yeah.
Do we have other questions or anything left over? We have just about a few more minutes, but we've covered a lot of ground. Jane has many what questions?
Jane has
So
many
I was
process
asking,
papers.
okay, yeah, I was asking if you could suggest a paper that uses coding to explain a process model in strategy. I know there's a Kaplan and Nordiskowski paper, but I don't know if you can suggest any others.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Let me just self-cite here. I'll throw you a couple of references in the chat.
There you go. Lots of names in the chat that are coming up. Other questions before we close? All righty. Thank you all for being here and for asking us lots of good and tough and challenging questions. That's why we come, because we want to be intellectually stimulated too. And so for us, it's always fun to see what people are thinking about, struggling with, but also, you know, how they may have approached their own data and just kind of get a bit creative as well and see what's currently being practiced out there. So thank you all for coming, and thanks again to Jane, Gail, and Anne for sharing their insights. And you all have a good AOM, and we'll see you hopefully in one of the other sessions.